Howdy folks, Hesty, Hesterman Motorworks. This video is for the Beetle Ute builders on my technique for installing the rear quarter panels, also known as the fenders. So we're gonna prep them for my technique of cutting the car behind the door, not in the door. How I prep them, the tools I use, and then where I apply panel bond and how I screw it on while it cures. If that's something that would be useful to you, stick around and hopefully I can provide you some valuable information. Here's a quarter panel that is all prepped and ready to go on, but I'm going to talk about what I did to get it prepped and to fit this style of mounting the quarters. So quarter comes from the factory with this front edge on it to match the back edge of the door. And I cut that. That's the first thing I do is cut off. It's right about a 1/2 inch at the top. Cut a little triangle off. There we go. And at the bottom, kind of radius that corner a little bit. Makes it easier fitting it in. So that's the first step I do. You can go ahead right now and take off about a 1/4 inch across this edge. You can do that later too, but you'll find it won't sit down, probably. It depends how it came trimmed from Smyth Performance. But that's the first step. Then I can fit this quarter panel onto the car and mark out where this line is going to be by tracing the steel that I left on the car so I can make it match. If you want to go ahead and start doing some of the other fitting while you have it sitting here, I have this one. I like to take this down a little bit. You'll find, since this is hand laid, there'll be little bumps every now and then where there's a little more fiberglass. So I take that surface down because I want that to lay nice and flat. And because I'm doing the bracket in the back, I do the same thing all along this surface, which is going to be bonded, and then where the roll pan fits here is going to be bonded. So you can just see in the sanding that that was a high point. So I took that down a little bit, that down a little bit, that down a little bit, and that helps you fit the quarter panel in nice and snug. What are the tools that I use to cut this down? And the amount I'm cutting down is just about the same amount as the steel. You don't want to make this too thin here, but you're at least going to go all the way through the gel coat. And then do a trial fit and see what it feels like there. So you can use a pneumatic sander, and that's a 50 or 70 grit on there, I can't remember. That works. Fairly tedious, but it will work if that's what you have. If you have an angle grinder, you can either get flap wheels or these stripper discs. This is a used one, so it looks pretty gunked up, but these work very well. These do too. This is a flap wheel. Love them. These take off material pretty quick, so go carefully and don't apply much pressure, because you can end up going through the fiberglass pretty quickly. If you happen to have one or be interested in it, these stripper tools, you can get them at Harbor Freight, but Eastwood also makes one called the SCT that it was in The Mandalorian. These are a really cool tool. I used the crap out of this when I was stripping all the rust off the old Volvo. So I already had one. That's basically the same kind of stripper drum, and you can get different grits for it, and that works really well. Again, depending on the grit you use, just be careful that you don't go too far. This works really well for on the inside, stripping, kind of leveling, and the size of these drums is just about perfect to match in this radius. So prepping that surface there works really well with these drum strippers. But you don't have to have one of those. It's just if you're interested in getting one, they're pretty handy. I really like how it does in this surface, taking the high points off so we can get a good surface to surface mating when we go to adhere this. You can see if you go quick, you'll just hit the high points off it like there and there. And if you take your time a little bit, there's usually kind of a ridge that runs right along here. So I take that down just a little bit. Again, be careful, don't go too deep. You just want to take the high points off. But it is nice to get this radius cleared out. Again, from the hand laying fiberglass, there's often a few lumps, and as you fit it, you'll see where it rides a little bit high on the fiberglass. Same for where your roll pan will fit. If you need to open this up a little bit, this corner sometimes has a little goober in it that you need to sand out so that it sits down nicely on this right here. And as you can see, I beveled that just a little bit with a sander just to make sure I don't get that back corner sitting up high, making a gap for a few inches there. This hand belt sander, they do make battery ones also. I've seen a DeWalt one. This happens to be a pneumatic one. Again, you don't have to go get it, but it works really well, clearing out down in here. And you can run it flat along here. And then of course, as we already looked at inside the steel, doing inside there. In preparation for fitting, I have the car up on a jack stand and the wheel off. I have not been able to fit this with the wheel on the car. I thought maybe you could, tried it a couple times, doesn't work. Normally I'm working on a lift, but this car is outside. So I also highly recommend taking off this bracket that normally sits right here on this stud. If you unbolted your fenders, that's the two holes that the rear fender bolts into. And there's simply a 10 millimeter nut on this stud and a 10 millimeter bolt up underneath there. And taking that bracket off and getting it out of the way is going to make life a lot simpler fitting this quarter panel. I'm going to show you how I fit it, the angle and how you get that started and drop it, blah, blah, blah. You'll see me have a little more trouble with this than I think you will, because I have an extra step here that I got to get it over where I added sill covers. So there's a little bit more to this sill than normal. So I got to do a little bit of flexing. You'll see that here in a minute when I go to trial fit this and show you the angles. So let's see if we can get that quarter panel on there, and then I'll show you the things that I check for. So here you can see where I ground it down. First marking it, then taking it back off and grinding it. You may be able to see how you're gonna have to take a 1/4 inch off the bottom of the fiberglass where it sits on a ledge in here. Normally that, shadow's killing me. Normally the fiberglass is on the outside of this steel and you want it to come down to the top of the sill. But we've got almost a 1/4 inch, not quite a 1/4 inch. So that's how I get that fitment. So let's say, pretend that this quarter panel has not been fitted before and it's not quite going in how we want it. A couple of things to check. So I start off, the beauty of this is that now we're not worried about the door gap. So we don't have to freak off about that. So we're looking that it is sitting on top of the aluminum across here. We check that by looking in here. And if it's not sitting down all the way, then we got to look at why not. Usually, the biggest culprit is here. Right? You're gonna have to do some trimming along this edge to match this. So on your first trial fit, what you can do is get it as close as you can, take your pen, lay your pen against the sill, and kind of trace that profile. Usually the bottom has a gap and it sits right here at the top, and you can see that little white witness mark where when I was trial fitting, it scraped off a little of the paint on this fiberglass. So that's the first place I would check. Second place I would check is the bottom of the fiberglass where it sits down in here. That's another possibility of not getting it to sit down all the way. You can kind of verify by this, because I really want these two to be as close as I can get it. If the fiberglass sits down low, then I have a lot of body work to do here to make this, to make that seam look good. Now that I have ground out the fiberglass, I can also kind of check that the steel is going to fit down in there well. And it looks like it is. Typically, the fiberglass likes to curve in a little further. So what I do, one, before I fit it, I have the holes in the steel pre-drilled. So when I put my screws in during adhesion, I can crank them up a little bit and pull the fiberglass out. To get the screw started, sometimes I have to take a screwdriver and push where you can see the light right here. That's the back of the fiberglass. So with my pen on there, I think we can see it come out when I push on it. Super handy when you're getting ready to attach the quarter panel. Just lay a screwdriver or a pen or something you can push on it with, so you can get that started easy. If the quarter panel is not sliding forward far enough and you still have a gap here in the back, obviously I'm trying to eliminate this gap. I want it to sit up nice and tight on there. Okay, it is, but let's say that it's not, and I need that whole quarter panel to go forward a little bit. Here's where I check. One, you can make sure if you added the blocking in here, have a look at that and see if it is hitting the fiberglass, preventing the fiberglass from going forward enough. If you didn't put enough bend in these aluminum plates, it won't slide forward all the way. Sometimes I have to lay down on the bottom with a flashlight and look up inside that cavity to check that. That's the first place I check to see what's preventing it from sliding forward. Another place, well, you have this joint right here, right? It might be catching there, or this may be catching on something here. Looking down inside, it might be catching on this, and that's what I was pushing on fitting the fiberglass. But a really common one is that corner right here. When you're trimming the car, you didn't get quite enough off there, and you have to come back and trim a little more. The next place to check is the aluminum that sits here. And sometimes, that cord just keeps going. Sometimes that aluminum is sitting against here and you can't push that forward any further. And this one's sitting as it should, but the way to check that is then by taking the fiberglass back off and looking for witness marks. By the way, that steel hitting that we just looked at up under here will make witness marks on the fiberglass also. Let's see if we can see them here. So if you look right there, so here's the quarter panel, that's the step side, we're on the inside. Those little witness marks right there, that's from the steel being just a hair too long and rubbing on the fiberglass before the quarter panel sat into place. If it's the aluminum, your witness mark is going to be right in here. So if that is the case, and it wasn't on this build, and that's not terribly common, but I have had it happen a couple times, that spot is right here, this corner. I have had to shave that corner off just a little bit to get that quarter panel to set forward all the way. Here's another look at the corner that I was saying you need to take off sometimes. I usually cut right at the edge of that doubler all the way up, but sometimes you got to come back and just take another 1/2 inch or so off into the doubler, just right on that corner. If we look down here, since there's not a quarter panel in the way and the sun's not messing us up, you can see that where the fiberglass is going to sit now is actually a little bit higher than the other style of mounting your quarter panels. So if you do this style, you got to cut that bottom edge just about 1/4 inch shorter. So check for witness marks there. Look inside the fender well for this. Rarely, but occasionally, somewhere else along this line. So stick your head in the wheel well. Another good reason to have the wheel off. By the way, I like to take the wheels off anyway when I'm mounting the bed so that it's easier to get at these bolts here and here. So I do recommend having the wheel off when you actually start building. Stick your head up in the fender well and check that to make sure that's not rubbing. And again, the shape of this is often different. Inside, hopefully before you started trial fitting, there is normally a piece of sound dampener right here on the inside of this steel. Heat and a oscillating saw and it'll come right off, or even a putty knife. That can hang up the fiberglass from sliding in, and you may have run into the plastic piece in here. Make sure you have that cut back far enough so your quarter panel is sliding in all the way there. When we get to prepping, we also got to make sure that we get all of that gunk off the inside of this steel. Again, heat gun works really well, and a putty knife, that stuff will flake right off here. And actually it's better to do it before you even cut the car, because then you don't have to cut through it here. It normally sits right about like this. And then that plastic piece down here, depending on the tools you have, there's the end of it where I cut it. I use the oscillating saw with a tooth blade on it. You don't have to do all the sanding on the quarter panel before you fit it. I find it's a whole lot easier to do that initial sand while I can clamp it down on a table and I can kind of lean onto it a little bit. It's also easier to do the wheel well shaping while it's on the bench. So I do the first level of sanding there. I don't worry about the horizontal surfaces because that's really easy once it's mounted, and I'm gonna do holes all through here. So that's all gonna get reworked again later. And this is kind of hard to do on the bench, so I leave that until it's mounted. You will find there's a few places where there's highs and lows. The gel coat works awesome as a guide coat. I think I've got this where a heavy primer will fill most of the issues I have here. There's a couple that I'll have to come back and hit with some body filler. I'll have to rework this shape. There's always a low spot right here, and there's usually one somewhere in here. That's just in the mold. On the driver's side, there is a high spot, and I think with the sun we'll be able to see it. There's a high spot somewhere, that's probably it there, where I've gone through the gel coat on the outside sanding. I've got my fitment perfect. I think I'm ready to put the 3M panel bond on and start gluing that quarter panel on here. Before you get too excited and start gluing your quarter panels on, do one more check that you have all your wiring completed. You're never gonna have the same access to some areas like this of the car. For example, if you're gonna reuse the fuel door hatch, make sure that that's all set It's a whole lot easier to do it now. The wire reaches, you have some kind of protection here so it doesn't chafe on that edge. Make sure your speaker wire for the passenger side speaker is coming through whatever you're doing for a speaker box. If you're doing a speaker box and it comes out the into the cab, so when you mount the speaker, you have it. This you'll be able to grab after the quarter panel is installed and get it into the fuel door. I like to run my bed light that is mounted up under here through this area like this. So that's what this is. So then I start cleaning this. I sand as much as I can the inside edges of this, especially where that plastic was on the inside of that steel and the sound abatement material. Prep this surface, although that's not going to get any adhesive right now because the fiberglass is going to just barely be off of this. You could goop it up real high with panel bond so that as you put it together, but if you winch this down too far, you're going to throw this alignment off. So be careful if you put a couple of set screws or a couple of tensioning screws in here. This is going to be glued all the way down. And of course, these surfaces here, I make a couple of little marks here and here so that once the quarter panel is on, I know where to put my tensioning screws. I do the same to try to avoid hitting the hinges, the rivets across here from the wheel well brace. So I know if I go in, and if I go out rather, 1.5 inches from this edge here, I'm going to clear those rivets. Just makes life a little easier. I also mark where these bolts are on the inside here, so they get covered by the quarter panel, but when I put the rear window surround on, I want to try to put a tensioning screw right here. So I make a little mark on the inside there and there so I can avoid those steel bolts. I have this pretty cool, this one happens to be pneumatic. It's a mini belt sander. Works really well for cleaning in here, and I use it other places on the car. Also prepping the fiberglass. If you don't have one of those, it works pretty well to use an oscillating saw. So here's the typical oscillating saw. I start with just the blade, and then when I'm actually prepping the inside of the steel, I just put some self-adhesive 80 grit on that, and I can use that up in here to prep that surface nicely, and that works out real well. Okay, so I got my holes drilled. If I need more, I can always drill more, but less is better as long as you're not getting any buckling. If I'm installing the quarter panel and I find it start to buckle, I can always drill another hole to help winch it together. I have my surfaces prepped as we just talked about in here, across there, and down the back. I have the same surfaces prepped on my quarter panel, on the inside, there, across there, all the way out to the end. So we're ready to go on. I showed you how I install the quarter panel, but what do I do when I'm gluing? I run at least 2 beads down here and maybe even one in the middle. I goop this up real good and that real well. So that's where I put panel bond on the car. Then over on the quarter panel, I butter this up. Now I'll run beads, but then I spread it out a little bit because as you slide it in, it likes to knife off. So I kind of butter it down here a little bit. Make sure you get a little bit up around the top there. And then I'm ready to fit it. I slide it on and I make sure I have my rearward fitment here, that it's all the way forward. And I'll go ahead and put a couple of these screws in, push down on it to make sure it's down, and then get a couple of those in. Boom, boom. Now You can go across the top every, I don't know, 4 to 6 inches maybe even less. It kind of depends on how well your quarter panel is fitting. You can do your screws down that way, pushing from the back on that fiberglass where needed. You can use a angled guy here and just stick it in there, and that kind of holds it. Well, I didn't get it quite right there, but you can kind of wedge that guy in there and that'll hold it in while you screw it together. Then I go back and check, wipe off my excess, and run these down. Now, as I'm looking at it, if I have a little bit of a gap, and that sometimes happens about halfway down, about here, the angle changes, and sometimes the quarter panel isn't laying up there enough, I have my heat gun all plugged in and ready to go. And I'll heat that back end of the quarter panel up while it's sitting here, heat that up, and then run those screws in. That way it is adhering, and also when the fiberglass cools, it will hold that shape and not be fighting the adhesion here. So when I take those screws out, it won't pop. I am usually able to get both quarter panels and the roll pan on in one nozzle on the adhesion, on the panel bond. So I go ahead and have my roll pan all set. I have those edges prepped. I have it marked exactly where it's going to fit to line up. So I can bang that guy in with the same tube, and I've got my clamps sitting right here ready to go. All right, so last question probably is, well, we got 2 more questions. Remember that some of the screws need to be shorter than others. The length of the screws across the top here really don't matter. So I use self-tapping, oh, that's not the right one, self-tapping 1-inch. And those seem to work out pretty well. So of course I have my driver all set up with the right bit. These, you have to use a 1/2 inch because you start hitting that and you can't winch it down all the way. So you got to have some 1/2 inch screws handy also. So just a few of the 1/2 inch to about there, then you can use the long ones again, and the long ones all the way across the top. The 1/2 inch ones are more prone to stripping out, so be careful, don't over torque them. And then you just end up causing yourself more body work. No big deal, it can be fixed. But while you have panel bond out and you stuff shifting around, it's kind of a pain. So I like to have everything set and try to minimize how much I'm trying to do while the glue is on. So obviously you need to have your driver ready along with your screws. So have that set out and ready to go. Obviously I don't want to set it here because the quarter panel and the panel bond are going to go there, but have it where you can grab it quickly. I have my pry bar laying right here, so I'm ready to push that quarter panel out. I'll plug in my heat gun in case I need it there, and I should be all set. My panel bond is warm. I got a couple of extra rags. Everything's set. So I've got everything prepped. I'm pretty happy with my fitment. My panel bond is warm, just enough warmth here that I think it'll be okay to go ahead and panel bond. So I'm gonna give it a good wipe down, put on my gloves, and we're gonna go ahead and put one of these quarter panels on. So with one tube of panel bond and one nozzle, we have managed to get the quarter panels on and the roll pan. So people are asking now, how much panel bond should I anticipate? I generally use 2.5 tubes. So the whole day today, I had a second one on deck ready to swap in if I ran out, because nothing's worse than spending a bunch of time, oh, where'd I put that other tube? But it depends on how many things you do panel bonding. On this particular car, the tail end edge flanges, I riveted them on. I often panel bond them on, but this car is gonna get bed linered, so I'm not worried about the rivets. They'll disappear under the bed liner. But I did do a spacer here, and I used panel bond for that, and a spacer that's gonna go under the rear window surround. So how much panel bond you're gonna use depends on how many things you use panel bond for. No duh. But I would say plan on 3 tubes, and you should be safe. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully that gives you some ideas about getting your quarter panels mounted. It's an exciting part because now the car is really starting to take shape and look cool. But it's kind of a critical piece because you can cause yourself a lot of body work by not getting it in right, or even have the car look kind of wonky when you're done. So the video, I didn't really show the 50 times that I trial fit, shaved a little bit, trial fit, shaved a little bit, trial fit. You're gonna do that a lot of times. Don't be afraid to take your time, and you can even practice a couple of times how you're gonna fit it while the glue is spread, because you'll get used to grabbing it this way and chucking it on, and then you spread the panel bond and you grab it that way, and now all of a sudden you got panel bond all over your hands, and you got to reapply, change your gloves, etc. So do a little bit of practice, take your time, get the fitment perfect, so when the car's all said and done, you're happy and you've saved yourself some significant body work. Anyway, hope that helped. Like and subscribe, always need the support. Appreciate everybody tuning in. Take care of each other. We'll catch you on the next video.